What is private property? Private property is the private ownership of lands and goods by non-governmental entities. This includes everything from the ground your house is sitting on to your collection of Marvel Funko Pops. Despite this being a pretty simple concept to grasp, some stubborn man-children throughout history have continued to misunderstand the concept and have tried to debunk it. Debunking private property is a giant oxymoron, as you'll see, as that would be like trying to debunk air. Yes, I'm going there. Because you see, private property is not an abstract concept. It's actually very human and very natural. So, first things first, we can't talk about private property without first talking about John Locke and natural rights. See, Locke over here was a 17th century fella from a dark, somber and rainy little island known as Britain. And so, speedrunning over his life a little bit, he eventually moved into the barbaric wasteland known as London, where he wrote some books. Most notably, a letter concerning toleration and 2 treatises of government. On these books, he talked about the state of nature, the role of a government, and of course, natural rights. Life, property, and liberty. These are the essential human rights, otherwise known as natural rights, and everything that you enjoy about your comfy modern Western lifestyle is derived from them. Everyone is the owner of themselves. Everyone is their own landlords, if you will. This is a concept known as self-ownership, which means that you, as an individual, are, well, the owner of yourself. I mean, you want me to spell it out for you? It's pretty self-explanatory. If your body was a house, then you are the landlord of it. Do you get it? To say otherwise would be to say that what you want as an individual is irrelevant, as you do not have the authority to decide what you want for yourself. To put it simply, if you were to try to argue against self-ownership, you would essentially be saying that it would be okay for a gang to come and kidnap you, tie you down to a chair, and force you to listen to Maury Calliope's discography. Goodbye. Why? Well, because it's not like you have any say over your own life or bodily autonomy anyways, so clearly there's no ethical reason why this shouldn't be allowed, right? Obviously, I'm exaggerating with the scenario to prove a point, but sometimes you gotta take things to their logical extreme to prove a point. So now we can get on to the good stuff. I've explained what self-ownership is, but I haven't really explained how self-ownership justifies private property. Sure, you own yourself, but why should you be able to own other stuff? Well, to put it simply, if you believe that you own yourself, then by extension you also have to believe in private property. If property can't be owned, then you can't possibly own yourself either, and that would return us to the scenario I explained earlier. How does something become yours, though? Who decides that? I think the best way to answer this question is with a different scenario. Say you're walking down a forest, and you stop at a random spot. You look around you and you say, all of this is mine now. Does that do the trick? Do you now own that land in the forest? The answer is no. You don't own that part of the forest just for standing on it. So now let's say that instead of just standing there, you decide to cut down a few trees and use that wood to make yourself a little cabin. What happens then? Do you now own that cabin? Do you own the land the cabin is standing on? The answer to both of those is yes. See, before you were just standing on that part of the forest without doing anything to it. But now, because you've used the resources and the forest to develop that land, you've, as John Locke puts it, mixed it with your own labor. What this scenario tries to show is that land and resources in their default state are owned by nobody. You can only lay claim to them after you mix them with your labor. And just like how no one can do anything to you that you don't consent to because you own yourself, no one can do anything to your property that you don't consent to because it's your property, not theirs. I think this scenario explains the labor theory of property pretty well, but I'm gonna finish it off with one more example, as this is a part of the labor theory of property that many people don't seem to know about. Using my forest scenario again, let's say you were walking down a forest and you happen to stumble upon a nice shiny cabin. This obviously signifies that someone had already been there before you, and as such, that land and resources probably belongs to someone else, and that would be a fair conclusion to make. But let's say this cabin doesn't look all new and shiny. Let's say it's completely run down, it's dusty, it has spider webs, the roof has a big hole in it, and it seems like no one has been there for years. Now what? Does that cabin still belong to someone else? The answer is maybe. However, it's most likely that the previous owner of the cabin no longer cares for it, which at this point means it's abandoned property. And yes, if the property is abandoned, that means you can claim it for yourself. One way to lay claim to the cabin would be to fix it up yourself, pouring your labor into it. The other way would be to demolish it entirely and build something else on top of it, such as a concrete house instead of a cabin. So this is a much more recent philosophy, way past the days of John Locke, and although it has its critics, I find it hard to argue against. Propertarianism essentially reduces all questions of ethics to the right to own property. In other words, every right that people talk about is in some way an extension of property rights. For example, you know the fundamental natural rights I explained earlier? Life, property, and liberty? Well, it could be argued that without property rights, the other two rights, life and liberty, would be completely moot. Remember that scenario I used earlier about the gangs and kidnappings? We already know the reason this is unethical is because it's being done to you against your will. But between life, property, and liberty, which of these rights is being infringed upon? You could say it's infringing upon your right to freedom, and you would be correct. You could say it's infringing upon your right to life, and that could also be correct. However, if you were to say it's infringing upon your property rights, it's correct, and it also covers the other two rights by extension. If it wasn't for self-ownership, any other rights that you can come up with would be meaningless, as unless you can own yourself, you don't have any rights. So to argue against private property would be to argue against your own rights as an individual.